Welcome, night dwellers, to Midnight Delight, where nightmares come to play. Gather round as I, your host, weave tales of terror and shadows that lurk just beyond the edge of your vision. Tonight we delve into the spine-chilling legend of the Mothman, a creature of darkness with glowing red eyes and wings that stretch across the night sky. Prepare yourself for an experience that will haunt your dreams and send shivers down your spine. This is Midnight Delight. It was a cold November night when I decided to take a drive through the back roads of West Virginia. The air was crisp, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. I had heard countless tales of the Mothman, the enigmatic creature said to haunt the forests near Point Pleasant, and I was determined to see if there was any truth to the legend. I had just passed the old TNT area, a place notorious for sightings, when my car's engine began to sputter. The headlights flickered and I found myself pulling over to the side of the road, surrounded by thick woods. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. As I stepped out of the car, a sense of unease washed over me. The stories I had heard flashed through my mind. Red eyes glowing in the darkness, wings that spanned the width of a road, and a presence that filled the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. I shook off the feeling and opened the hood of my car, hoping it was just a minor issue. That's when I heard it. A low, almost mechanical hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the trees, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just beyond the tree line, were two piercing red eyes, glowing like embers in the night. The figure was tall, easily 7 feet, with broad, dark wings that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. It stood motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The creature took a step forward, and I finally found the strength to move. I bolted back to my car, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the keys. The engine started, and I sped down the road, my heart pounding in my chest. In the rearview mirror, I saw the Mothman take flight, its wings flapping slowly as it rose into the sky and vanished into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my home. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked, that the Mothman had chosen to reveal itself to me for a reason. Even now, as I recount the story, a chill runs down my spine. The Mothman is out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to cross its path. I never considered myself a superstitious person, but that all changed during my summer in Point Pleasant. I was a college student interning at a local newspaper, eager to make a name for myself. When my editor assigned me to investigate the numerous sightings of the Mothman, I saw it as a chance to write a compelling human interest piece. Little did I know, I was stepping into a nightmare that would haunt me forever. The first few weeks were uneventful. I interviewed locals who claimed to have seen the creature, listened to their stories, and gathered as much information as I could. Most accounts were similar: red eyes, enormous wings, a sense of impending doom. But they all seemed like folklore, stories passed down to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Everything changed on a warm, humid night in August. I decided to visit the old TNT area, the abandoned World War II munitions site that had become synonymous with the Mothman sightings. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I ventured into the overgrown labyrinth of decaying bunkers and rusting machinery. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, a metallic tang that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I snapped a few photos, took some notes, and began to explore deeper into the site. That's when I felt it. A presence. Watching me. I turned quickly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. I laughed it off as nerves and continued on, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step. I reached an old, partially collapsed bunker and decided to take a break. As I sat on a moss-covered rock, I heard a faint, almost mechanical hum. It was the same sound described by so many of the witnesses. My heart raced as I stood up and scanned the area with my flashlight. The beam fell on something that made my blood run cold. 2 red eyes staring at me from the shadows. The eyes were set into a figure that stood over 6 feet tall, with massive wings folded behind it. It stepped forward, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The stories were true. The Mothman was real. I backed away slowly, but my foot caught on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. The creature moved closer, its eyes never leaving mine. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The humming grew louder, and I could hear the flapping of wings behind me. Panic set in as I navigated the twisting paths of the TNT area, desperate to find my way out. I burst through the tree line into the parking lot, grasping for breath. My car was the only one there, and I wasted no time getting inside and locking the doors. The humming stopped, and the silence was deafening. I looked around, half expecting the Mothman to appear at my window, but there was nothing. I drove back to town as fast as I could, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes staring back at me. I knew I had to go back to find out more, but the fear was almost too much to bear. I spent the next few days combing through my notes and interviews, trying to piece together any clues that might help me understand what I had seen. Then, I received a call from an anonymous tipster who claimed to have information about the Mothman. They wanted to meet at an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet them at dusk the next day, unaware that I was walking into a deeper, darker mystery than I could have ever imagined. Dusk settled over the horizon as I drove to the farmhouse. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows over the abandoned property. The house itself was a dilapidated structure, with broken windows and an air of forgotten history. I parked my car a few yards away and approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The silence was unnerving. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. I called out, but my voice echoed back to me unanswered. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint whisper from upstairs. I hesitated, then slowly climbed the rickety staircase, each step feeling like a leap of faith. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. I reached the top and followed the sound to a small room at the end of the hall. Inside, I found an old man sitting in a rocking chair, his eyes wide with fear. He looked up at me, his voice trembling as he spoke. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked. "The Mothman." I nodded, unable to find my voice. The old man gestured for me to sit, and I did, pulling up a dusty chair. "I used to work at the TNT area," he began, "back when it was still operational. We were working on something we shouldn't have. The Mothman is not just a creature, it's a harbinger, a warning of something far worse. He told me about strange experiments, about trying to harness some unknown energy source. The Mothman appeared shortly after they started, and accidents began to happen. Workers disappeared, equipment malfunctioned, and there were reports of strange lights in the sky. The government shut the site down, but the damage was done. The Mothman was here to stay. "There's more," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Mothman is connected to the old lighthouse by the river. That's where you'll find your answers. But be careful, it doesn't like trespassers." With that, the old man fell silent, his eyes closing as if he had said too much. I thanked him and left, the weight of his words heavy on my mind. The lighthouse by the river was known for its treacherous paths and eerie atmosphere, but I knew I had to go. The next day I made my way to the lighthouse. The journey was arduous, the path overgrown and barely visible. As I approached, I felt the same sense of unease that I had at the TNT area. The lighthouse stood tall and foreboding, its windows dark and empty. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was as dilapidated as the farmhouse, with peeling paint and broken furniture. I climbed the spiral staircase to the top, each step echoing in the silence. At the top I found an old, dusty journal. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and sketches of the Mothman. The final entry caught my eye. "The Mothman is not alone. There are others, waiting in the shadows. They are the bringers of doom, the heralds of disaster. Beware the night of the blood moon, for that is when they will rise." As I read the last words, a chill ran down my spine. The blood moon was only a few days away. I had to warn the town, to tell them what I had learned. But as I descended the stairs, I heard the hum again, louder and more menacing than before. I reached the bottom and ran outside, but it was too late. The sky had darkened and the Mothman was there, its red eyes glowing in the twilight. It spread its wings and let out a deafening screech, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. I knew then that the old man was right. The Mothman was not just a creature, it was a warning, and something far worse was coming. I had to get out of there, to find a way to stop whatever was going to happen. I ran back to my car and drove to the newspaper office, my mind racing. I had to write my story to get the word out, but as I typed, I realized that it might already be too late. The blood moon was coming, and with it, the harbingers of doom. The night of the blood moon arrived, and the town of Point Pleasant was plunged into chaos. Strange lights appeared in the sky, and people reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the darkness. The Mothman sightings increased, and a sense of fear gripped the community. I did everything I could to warn them, but it wasn't enough. The harbingers of doom had arrived, and there was no stopping them. The Mothman was just the beginning, a prelude to a nightmare that would haunt Point Pleasant forever. To this day, I still hear the hum in the silence, see the red eyes in the darkness. The Mothman is out there waiting, and I fear that one day it will return to finish what it started. It was the summer of 1995 when my twin brother Daniel and I decided to take a road trip across the country. We had just graduated from college, and the open road seemed like the perfect way to celebrate our newfound freedom. Our destination was Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a place shrouded in mystery and folklore, particularly the legend of the Mothman. Little did we know, this trip would change our lives forever. We arrived in Point Pleasant on a sweltering July afternoon. The town had a quaint charm with its historic buildings and friendly locals. We checked into a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly couple who were more than happy to share their stories of the infamous Mothman sightings that had plagued the town since the 1960s. That evening, Daniel and I decided to visit the Mothman Museum, a small but intriguing place dedicated to the legend. As we perused the exhibits, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if I had been here before. Daniel, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as my overactive imagination. After leaving the museum, we made our way to the Silver Bridge, the site of the tragic collapse in 1967 that many believed was linked to the Mothman. The bridge had been rebuilt, but the air around it felt heavy with sorrow and mystery. As we stood by the river, the sun dipping below the horizon, a chill ran down my spine. "Do you feel that?" I asked Daniel, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression serious for once. "Yeah, it's like we're being watched." We both turned, scanning the area, but saw nothing. We shrugged it off and headed back to our car, but the feeling of unease lingered. That night, I was plagued by vivid nightmares. I saw the Mothman, its red eyes glowing in the darkness, its wings casting an ominous shadow over the town. It spoke to me in a language I couldn't understand, but the message was clear. We were in danger. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sense of dread still gripping me. I glanced over at Daniel, who was sleeping peacefully. I decided not to wake him and tried to go back to sleep, but the nightmares continued. The next morning, we visited the old TNT area where many of the Mothman sightings had occurred. The place was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the chirping of birds in the distance. We explored the abandoned buildings, taking photos and trying to piece together what happened. As we were about to leave, we heard it. A low mechanical hum that seemed to come from all directions, just like everybody says. We froze, our eyes wide with fear. The hum grew louder, and then we saw it. The Mothman perched on a rusted beam, its red eyes locked onto us. Daniel and I ran, our hearts pounding, but the Mothman followed. It swooped down, its wings creating a gust of wind that nearly knocked us off our feet. We made it to the car and sped away, the creature disappearing into the trees. Back at the bed and breakfast, we tried to make sense of what we had seen. Daniel was shaken, his skepticism shattered. We decided to leave Point Pleasant the next day, but as night fell, the nightmares returned, even more intense than before. This time, the Mothman wasn't alone. I saw shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with the same eerie red light. They surrounded me, their voices a cacophony of whispers that I couldn't understand. I woke up screaming, and Daniel rushed to my side. "We have to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever this is, it's not just a legend." We packed our bags and left before dawn, but the feeling of being watched never left us. As we drove through the misty morning, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being followed. We sped out of Point Pleasant, the oppressive sense of dread clinging to us like a second skin. The road ahead was long, winding through dense forests and desolate countryside. Despite the early hour, the sky was overcast, casting an ominous shadow over our path. Daniel drove in tense silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those terrifying red eyes following us. As we crossed into Ohio, The tension began to ease, but only slightly. We stopped for breakfast at a small diner, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. The place was empty except for a lone waitress who served us with a tired smile. We barely touched our food, our minds still reeling from the events in Point Pleasant. After leaving the diner, we continued our journey, but the feeling of being watched returned. The radio crackled with static, and I swear I could hear faint whispers hidden within the noise. Daniel tried to stay focused on the road, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We decided to take a detour, hoping to shake off whatever was following us. The back roads were narrow and winding, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in on us. As the day wore on, the sky darkened and a thick fog began to roll in. By late afternoon, we found ourselves in a small forgotten town that wasn't on our map. The place seemed deserted, the buildings old and crumbling. We pulled into a gas station, hoping to get our bearings. The attendant, an old man with a weathered face, gave us a wary look. "You boys lost?" he asked, his voice rough. I nodded. "We're trying to get back to the main highway. Can you help us?" He glanced around nervously. "Best you head straight out of here. There's been strange things happen around these parts. Folks say they've seen the Mothman." My heart skipped a beat. "The Mothman? Here?" The old man nodded. "Seen him myself. Red eyes, wings like a bat. You don't want to be here after dark." We thanked him and got back in the car, a sense of urgency returning. As we drove out of town, the fog thickened, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. Daniel cursed under his breath as he tried to restart it, but it was no use. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere with darkness closing in. I got out to check under the hood, my hands trembling. The fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet ahead. That's when I heard it. The hum. It was low, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, more intense. I turned around and saw them, the red eyes glowing through the fog. "Daniel!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "It's here!" He scrambled out of the car, his eyes wide with terror. The Mothman emerged from the fog, its wings spread wide, casting an eerie shadow. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures appeared, their eyes glowing the same crimson red. They moved slowly, deliberately, surrounding us. We backed up against the car, nowhere to run. The creatures closed in, their whispers filling the air. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and turned to see a shadowy figure standing right behind me. Its touch was icy, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me. Just when I thought it was the end, a blinding light pierced through the fog. The creatures recoiled, their eyes narrowing. The light grew brighter, and I heard a voice shouting our names. It was the old man from the gas station holding a powerful flashlight. "Get in the car," he yelled. "I'll hold them off." We didn't need to be told twice. We jumped back into the car, and miraculously the engine roared to life. We sped away, the figures disappearing into the fog. The old man watched us go, his flashlight the only beacon in the darkness. We drove non-stop until we reached the safety of a larger town. We checked into a motel, exhausted and shaken. That night we didn't sleep. The events of the past 2 days were played in our minds, a never-ending nightmare. The next morning we called our parents and told them everything. They urged us to come home immediately. We didn't need convincing. As we drove back, the sense of being watched gradually faded, but the fear never truly left us. Years later, Daniel and I rarely speak about our encounter with the Mothman. It was a shared trauma that bonded us in silence. We both knew that the legend was real, that the Mothman and its dark companions were out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear the hum, faint and distant, a reminder of those couple days in Point Pleasant. You just heard the dark and eerie tale of the Mothman. As you lie in bed tonight, remember that the shadows may be closer than they appear, and the red eyes might just be watching you. Thank you for joining me at Midnight Delight, where nightmares come to play. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more spine-tingling stories that will keep you awake long after midnight. Until next time, sweet dreams.